Hey, hello. Get my headset on. Welcome back. You might notice that it's louder than usual today. I've upped my system volume, so if it's still too quiet for you, let me know. It can go higher than this if necessary. So let me know if this is good for you guys. Test, test. Hello. Comments say volume seems fine. Good. All right. Then we are good to go. Okay, so from the homeworks I've looked at so far, it looks like most people did pretty well, but there were some weird solutions. There were a lot of good solutions, but there were some weird solutions, complicated ones. It seems like some people took an approach that probably took a pretty long time to get there. So I'm going to see if I can demonstrate what I thought was going to be the way most people took. Let's call it the simpler approach to finishing it. Alright, so without further ado, let's get into homework 1. So the basics were you were supposed to have a panel where you can choose a customized color. So you could enter red, green, and blue values and then hit a confirm button, and it would lock in your choice. It would show you a little preview of the choice. It would also show you what color you had selected previously. It's basically like any painting application. Someone asked, will this be posted online? Yeah, I'll post the whole solution that I type here as soon as I'm done with it, so you don't have to type along or anything if you don't want to. And on the other screen, you had a 50 by 50 grid of rectangles, and they were supposed to be square as long as the panel is square. For the bonus, you had them resize along with the panel. Those are all random colors at the start, and when you click and move your mouse over any square, it changes to the picked color in the other panel, so you get to basically draw. If you made those squares small enough, if you made them pixel size big, that would basically be a very primitive version of paint, right? And then for the bonus, you could make the brush bigger so that you could draw larger, more pixels at the same time. So basically we're making a really primitive paint here. Alright, so the first thing you need to think about is what kind of classes do you need in order to pull this off. So you definitely need your driver. I saw a couple people try to make both of the panels the same class. That's a lot of added complexity. They're two completely different panels, so why don't we give them two completely different names. I'm going to call it color picker panel will be the one panel where we choose the colors, and let's see, what did I name it before? We'll call it color grid will be the other panel. We'll work on those in a bit. Now, what should we use for our color grid? What do we use for those little rectangles? I kind of gave you a bit of a red herring by going over labels and buttons and all of that complicated stuff the other day. You could definitely have used a button or a label, or I even saw quite a few people use panels for the individual squares. So each square is its own panel. The problem with using panels is that the mouse is not supposed to drag between panels by design. So if I start highlighting text in this panel, it would be bad design if it started to, as I moved into my other panel over here, doing something. It shouldn't be doing anything. It shouldn't even respond to this event. Likewise, if I had my browser open or something and I started dragging into that, it shouldn't start highlighting text in my browser. So generally speaking, you're not passing mouse dragged events between panels. So if you went that approach, you had to find what was ultimately a pretty difficult way to pigeonhole that solution in. It was possible, but it wasn't easy. So you gave yourself quite a bit of a challenge. What I would recommend would be to make a class to represent those individual squares. I called it grid unit. And what should grid units be? I thought it would be best if they were rectangles. I think a rectangle, simple rectangle, satisfies all of the requirements that we have for this assignment. So extends rectangle 2D.double. And since we're already in this class, we can get started and just finish it because it's a pretty short one. Each little square in your grid should have its own color. So we'll call it just color. All right. And I'm going to, in the constructor for each square, randomize the color. So let's start the constructor. We're going to take some arguments there later, but for now, let's just say color is new color. There are several ways to get a random color. The fastest way is to do math.nextInt and remember the color code for the largest possible color in hex, which is 0xFFFFF, but that's too much to remember, so my preference is to do 3 math.randoms. You might ask, well, doesn't math.random give you a number from 0 to 1? And I say yes, it does, but the color library supports the ability to give a decimal number from 0 to 1 instead of an integer from 0 to 255, and it will just multiply by 255 for you. So just one of those convenient extras in there. Unfortunately, math.random gives you a double, and the color expects a float if you're using the decimal number, so you have to make that cast there. You could also do random.nextInt 255 or math.random times 255 and cast the whole thing as an int. Lots of ways to get a random color. I feel like this one takes the least space. Okay, now we are extending rectangle 2D, so we need an x and a y, a width and a height, and those are, of course, doubles in rectangle 2D.double. So let's take an x, a y, a width, and a height. And how do we pass those along to our rectangle superclass? How do we pass that information back along? We'd have to use super in that case, right, in order to pass it along. The other option, this is also, I think, a good idea, is to keep the grid units separated from their drawing, so keep them abstract. You can, rather than extending rectangle 2D.double, have each of your grid units maintain their own rectangle that is responsible for their display. Much like this, all right? And then you don't have to extend the rectangle class. I think this is also a good approach. I to some extent prefer this one because the grid units might have functionality outside of just being a rectangle, and this is a little bit clearer. If you want to access a grid unit's display, you just talk to its display unit. So let's do it this way. I'm going to instantiate it up here with just some placeholder values. All right. And when you designate a grid unit the way we've got here, I'm going to set the x and the y up like that. How about the width and the height? So I want these to be able to resize. So I can definitely change their width and height like this. There's also a shortcut for setting all 4 of these values at the same time in rectangle, right? That's going to be called set frame. It allows you to set all 4 of these values at the same time. So we could do that instead, get it a little bit shorter. We could also add other constructors here too, constructors that set up a grid unit that's empty, set up a grid unit with just a random color. So this sets up a grid unit at the given xy location with given width height. We could add some others, like for example a blank one. Sets up a empty grid unit with no size, but a random color. Something like that. And we should add to that comment and a random color. Okay, other utilities that we might need, we probably want the ability to update the unit's width and height and all of that, so let's add some set size. In case you don't want to have to update them individually, let's add the ability to take both the width and the height here as arguments. Notice I get to say display.everything instead of this.everything. Can be a little easier to understand. We can do the same thing for location. Okay, and then of course the code to actually draw it to the screen. So this is something that we did a lot in 228 and 328. We had all of our little custom objects have their own custom draw method. This one's going to be no different. So we're going to take a graphics 2D object. We're going to, I decided to give them a black outline. That's what the ones in the example look like. So the color gets set to black first, and then we're going to draw the display. That draws the outline. And then we're going to set the color to our preset color at the top, and then we're going to fill it. Okay, so that's going to allow us to fill it. And now we also need a custom method to get the contains from our display because I made it private. So this is going to return true if the mouse contains the point. Obviously we're going to need that down the road in order to figure out if the mouse is inside of a particular spot. Alright, so we're looking at if the display, and then we're just going to pass along to displays contains method. If it contains that point, then true. Otherwise, false. I think that's everything we're going to need for the grid unit so far. We'll circle back if we need something else. So now let's get started on the panels. I think I'll work on the picker first. Now, how did I get the UI looking the way I did? I saw a lot of great uses of different layouts and everything, and I'm happy to see those. A lot of people used the Java layouts. Not too many people built their own custom layouts, so I'm going to build my own custom layout here. So this color picker panel extends a JPanel, and I'm going to add all of the components in here. Just going to copy and paste those in for my solution. Obviously we've got our current color label, the current color image label. It'll become clear what all of these are later. I just want to point out that I always name my elements with label or text field or button in the name, and the reason I do that is because when I'm typing like this dot and I want to find a particular button, right? So let me go ahead and make the constructor for this. And if I type this dot and I'm looking for a certain button, if I start typing button, I can see all the buttons that I have in this panel. If I start typing text field, I can see all the text fields. So now I don't have to remember what I've called them as well. I only have to remember the beginning. A lot of people prefer camel case for UI elements, where they, or sorry, not camel case, snake case for UI elements, where they separate things with underscores. I don't mind if you do that either. It's also something that I sometimes prefer. Giving everything lowercase but separating it with underscores can make it a little bit easier to read. Okay, and I'm also going to need globals for the color value. So some people just use the color variable. Some people had red, green, and blue. I'll just split the difference. I'll have both. I'll have red, green, and blue, and a color value. And this color is going to be the thing that we're going to need to get over to the other panel somehow. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to get this over to our instance of color grid. And the constructor also, I think we've seen many times before, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy that stuff in as well. And we're going to set the preferred size, set the background, everything we usually do. Notice I haven't used the mouse or keyboard listener on this yet. I will probably need a mouse listener, though, at some point, right? Let's think about that. Do I need a mouse listener? Well, no, not on the picker panel, because all I have is a button, and buttons can have their own listeners. So I actually don't need any mouse or keyboard listeners on the picker panel, right? Okay, and I'm going to set up the labels and everything here as well. I'm going to copy that in, and we'll just go over it for a second. So the current color label is the one that says the current color is, and then the red, the green, and the blue values. If you didn't want to have a red, green, and a blue variable, you could have accessed those values like this with color.getRed or something. So you actually don't need these three variables here, but it can help to keep track if you want them. Okay, I would actually say it's better not to have them, because then there's less chance that these don't match that. Okay, you might not necessarily have the same red in your color as you have up there, and that can get confusing. Okay, so the current color label tells you what the current color is, and then the image label is the one that's the actual colored square. So I could have used the rectangle for that too instead of a label. I chose to just use a label since we're using labels for everything here. So that just has the background of the color. Right, and then the red label, green label, and blue label just say red, green, and blue respectively. The error label tells you whether or not there's been a problem with your color choice, so that's going to be the one that goes off if you type -5 or something in there, so by default that's blank. And then I have the text fields where you can enter the color values, and I have those starting off with red, green, and blue by default. Why do I have this little double quote here? Well, if I omit it, right, then I don't have a string in that field, and sometimes when you don't have a string and it's expecting a string, it complains. So in this case, it's using jTextField int columns instead of jTextField the string text. Okay, so this is not the constructor that I'm looking for, right? I don't think I saw anybody make this mistake, but a few people probably stumbled on it and eventually figured it out. If you want a string in there, you either have to convert red to string, or Java is pretty good at understanding this expression. This is the fastest way to get an integer into string form. Just put double quotes and then add or concatenate on the int, and it'll realize that you meant it was a string instead. And now I get the right constructor, the one I'm actually looking for, where I make a text field with some preset text. I've got the confirm button, and I've added an action listener to the confirm button. I have a few imports, and that's going to trigger a method I'm going to call confirm color. Let's go ahead and let's not make that there. I'll make that further down. That's going to trigger a method called confirm color, which I'm going to work on later, and that's going to lock in the user's color choice. Then I've added all of those to my layout. All right, and let's also do the bonus here before we move on. Let's do the first clearing out of the text fields when the user enters them. So those are going to be focus events, remember, for a text field. A focus event triggers when the user enters that, either with the mouse by clicking in it or by tab. And all we have to do is when the text field in question gains focus, we set its text to blank. So we just empty it out. So that was as simple as that. That's a 3-point bonus right there. So do that for all 3 of the text fields. Whenever the user enters them, they get blanked out. Now for the mnemonic, that was the hint that it's called a mnemonic. That is when the user hits the Alt key and then some key. So if you see an Eclipse here, I have File, Edit, all these things at the top. If I hit Alt F, I can open up File very quickly. In this case, Alt E will trigger Save As if I'm in that menu. So Alt F, Alt E allows me to save. This is an important accessibility feature for people who have limited use of their hands and can only use their keyboard, but it's also a popular power user feature. Power users typically don't touch their mouse at all, right? So they like to do everything from the keyboard. So your applications should always support the ability to do everything from the keyboard, both for accessibility and to support your power users. And the way you do that is simply to add a mnemonic to your button. Okay, the mnemonic, if you read the description, tells you it's the key which combined with the look and feels mouseless modifier, usually Alt, I believe Command on Mac, will activate this button if focus is contained somewhere within the button's ancestor window. So if the focus is anywhere inside of this panel, so the panel is the ancestor window in this case, then Alt plus C will be like clicking this button. Okay, another thing that you want to do, by the way, for support, accessibility support that you never have to do, and you definitely didn't have to for this assignment, is set label for. So I have these three labels, red, green, and blue, and those are labels for these three text fields, the red, green, and blue text fields. Now you can see that because you have good eyes, but if you were blind, you wouldn't be able to see that. And so set label for provides a tip for those who are sight limited. When they hover over the text field, it will read the label. They have those softwares that read the screen for them. It'll read that label for them. So that's really convenient if you have limited vision. So definitely include those. If you're in senior design and you need to score accessibility points for that assignment, that's one way to get it. Okay, so I made a DIY layout manager for this. First I'm going to make this confirm color method, and we'll get back to that later. Just so I don't have the error going. But we'll circle back to that because it's pretty straightforward. Let me show you what I did for my layout here. Let's call it Resize Components. Resize Components. Okay. So making your own layout is very tedious. I'm going to show you how tedious it actually is. But it allows you to get exactly the look and feel that you want. So I made mine using kind of a grid-based approach. So the first thing I did was I got the width and the height of the panel. You can get those with get width and get height. And then I decided to pick a unit size. All of my components would be scaled in proportion to this unit. So it's a 20th of the width and a 10th of the height. Those are my width and height units. And everything's going to be scaled in accordance with those. And then I have a starting X and a Y. I'm going to use those as offsets later on. So first I offset everything 1 unit from the top left of the screen. That's going to make sure that everything's not lodged right up against the top left corner. I set the location of the label then to that spot. So that puts it 1 width, 1 height unit away from the top left of the screen. And then I make that label 12 width units wide, so it spans 12 20ths of the screen. So 1 20th is spacing, 12 20ths is my bar, and then it's 1 20th tall. Okay, X moves up by the size of the thing. The next item over, the image label, that gets to be 2 width units large and 1 height unit. That actually makes it square, I think, because my width units are twice as big. No. Yes, that makes it square because my height units are twice as big, assuming that the screen is square. And again, all of this is in proportion to the width and the height of the panel. And I continue that way for all of the other elements, just manually placing them along the way. And now all I have to do is every time the screen gets redrawn, I need to call this method again in order to move all of my stuff around. So in the typical paint component method that we're used to, I just call Resize Components right there, and that's going to resize everything on the screen. Okay, and last but not least, let's get that confirm color method done. So you needed to be able to print the old color out, so you needed to store the previous color. So I'm going to save the previous color before I update the new one. I'll call it old green and old blue. Okay, and you also needed to reject bad colors, negatives, words, things that are outside the range of 0 to 255. I saw a lot of people do these as manual checks, but checking it manually is really hard. You need to accommodate for things like max int, so like a billion, trillion, million should go out of bounds and not count at all, shouldn't crash. Negative numbers, letters, maybe Chinese characters, anything you can type in that box should be rejected. The easiest way was to do this using exception handling. So I'm going to try, and I'm going to lazily catch any possible exception that could happen during me updating the color. Now, what happens if the update of the color fails? Well, the red should go back to what it was, the green should go back to what it was, and the blue should go back to what it was. So whatever updating I did up there should be undone. Okay, I'm going to set the text of my error label text to not a valid color, and then let's give them a hint, 0 to 255 only. Okay, and I'll print something to the console as well, just for my benefit. Error entering a color, something like that. Okay, but let's say that it does go well, or at least what we're going to do to try to make it go well. So first we need to get the contents of the red, green, and blue text fields. We're going to use integer.parseInt for this. So parseInt fails with a number not handled exception, something along those lines. And okay, so I don't remember the name of my text field. Let's go with field, and now I remember it's red text field. So see, very convenient for looking it up. It makes you never have to go back to the top to look at what you call your text fields. You can always just look up their names quickly by typing this, and then start typing text field, and you'll find yours in the list there somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to get the red, green, and blue fields this way. And notice that I'm updating red, green, and blue, the top red, green, and blue, the ones that the whole application tracks. Then that's why I have to revert them down here if I make a mistake. I could do it the other way around. I could update the temp ones or something, but remember, I do need these old values in order to properly print out what the previous color just was. Okay, so that's going to be the green, and that's going to be the blue text fields. Alright, so that updates the color, and this is a part that some people tried to do manually as well. They tried to make sure red, green, and blue matched, so they used the try and the catches or whatever approach they had to manually make sure red, green, and blue were valid and correct numbers, and then they made the color outside of exception handling. I actually don't care if red, green, and blue are valid colors. It will also get caught by this exception handling, right? So if the user enters 400 for red, then this line will be the line that fails, and we will still have the exception handling occur. So we actually don't care at what step it fails. I also have to update that label. Again, I forget what I called it. Let's see, current color image label, I think, is the one I'm thinking of. And that one, I want to set its background to the new color. And then I want to update that text. I believe I just recycled the error label for the previous text. So error label, maybe not the most apt name, but that's fine. So we'll call it color updated. Previous color was. And then I think I'm going to need to use those old ones there. So old red. Do a space, old green, and old blue. Alright, so that handles the changing of the color and the telling you what the previous color was, and then somehow, hopefully, the current color gets updated as well. So let me scroll back up and just copy this remaking of the label. Make sure I have the text match exactly. And that's going to be whatever that label's name is. Let's see, I think I called it current color. And fix those up, and that remakes that label. So all of these I probably could have moved to their own method too, something like an update method, but that's fine. And so that should work for the picker panel here. I think at this point I would probably test it. So let me go ahead and in my driver add my picker panel and launch it, see if I can get it to open. So this is going to be, whoops, forgot to make a main method. Okay, so this is going to be my picker panel here. Finished all my imports. Let's see what that looks like. Looks good. If I click inside of the cells, the number vanishes. If I type something in the cells that's wrong and hit confirm, then it just rejects it and does nothing. I can use Alt-C to hit the confirm button, and it tells me what the previous was, tells me what the new color is. So 200 there. Let's go Alt-C again, and that's pink. Okay, that works well. Let's move on to the next panel, and feel free to let me know if you have any questions so far. Okay, moving on to the next panel. Some people tried to fit them both into the same frame. I wouldn't. Notice I called it picker frame here. I'm going to call the next one a grid frame, and the color grid panel, of course, rather than the color picker panel. I haven't made the constructor yet. That's why I have this error. I actually called it color grid here, so color grid. Well, I'll leave the name there. That's fine. Okay, so we need to go back and make our color grid extend panel and add the usual constructor and the usual suspects there. So let's go back and do that. And that should fix the errors in driver and allow us to have two panels. Notice I have them coming up side by side by default, and I have their names up there. That's because I set their locations on the screen. It would have been better if I didn't hard code these. Like I showed you in the example, you can make these in proportion to the size of the user's screen, but they are so small that they'll fit into anything 720 and smaller, so it doesn't particularly matter. I just put them manually. And you didn't have to size them to the screen either. That wasn't part of the assignment anywhere. Okay, so this is going to need a mouse listener and everything. So let's go ahead and implement mouse input listener. And if you did the bonus, so if you did the resizing of the cursor to be larger or smaller, for drawing, then you would have also needed a key listener in order to catch the keys there. Okay, and this is going to add a crap load of unimplemented methods. And then also, don't forget, I had a couple people come in for office hours because they forgot to add those lines there in order to have the panel properly listen for the mouse and keyboard input. So don't forget to add those to the constructor. Okay, now how do I want to build the grid? So some people used an array list, some people used a one-dimensional array. I think the best way to go was definitely a two-dimensional array, because this is a two-dimensional grid. It has rows and columns. And what I would also encourage you to do is not to make the 2D array directly on the panel whenever you're working with something a little more complex like this. I like to make a class that manages the grid. So I'll call this, this is kind of a game, so I'll call it Grid Game Manager. This is going to manage the size of my grid and different properties about it. That allows me not to have to worry about those things on the panel, because this isn't really part of the display code. I like to keep that UI stuff separately. And so this is an array of grid units. Sorry, a two-dimensional array of grid units. That's the primary task of this class here, is managing those. It's going to be rows, by columns big. This allows me to easily change the size. It basically gives me a settings field to change the size. I might also take this in the constructor later on so that you can specify different size grids in the panel. Okay, and just as a quick guide to how things are addressed in two-dimensional arrays, right? So there's 0, 0 is the top left item, then it should be 0, 1, then it should be 0, 2, and so forth, right? And then likewise on the next row, you have 1, 0, then you have 1, 1, then you have 1, 2, and so forth, and all the way to 50 by 50, right? So a little refresher if you've forgotten how 2D arrays are addressed. Let's go ahead and make the constructor here. I already did all the important stuff at the top, the creation of the grid. Now I need to instantiate all the items inside of it. So let's go from row 0, row is less than rows, row plus plus. One of the reasons that I like having a row and column field instead of just using grid is because if you use grid.length here, it's ambiguous. Is that this dimension or that one? It might not be 50 by 50, it might be 50 by 100. That makes it more complicated to work with, because then you have to include this weird little thing that basically means nothing to anybody. So better to just have all your dimensions spelled out as variables. Okay, and then same thing for the columns. I need a nested loop in order to loop through the entire thing. There we go. Got there eventually. Okay. And I'm going to access every item in that array and instantiate a grid unit there. And so I had this blank constructor that just makes it with a random color and not a location. I'm going to use that one at first. So an empty grid unit with no size, no location, but a random color. All right, let's make another constructor that also sizes them to a location. So I'm going to take a width and a height that each square should be. How about that? I'll work on that one later. And let's do a draw method so I can draw the entire game at once. That's going to be me looping through all of those items and calling the draw method that I set up there. Okay, so this is going to draws the entire grid. And draws the entire grid. This sets up a game of blank grid units, no locations or size, random colors. Sets up a game of grid units with the given width and height. Now the reason I haven't changed this yet, why I haven't made any additions to the Grid Game Manager version that takes a width and a height, is that I know I'm going to have to resize the display anyway for the bonus. So I'm going to go ahead and write the method that resizes the display for the bonus. Double width and double height. Let's call this for a screen of the given, or even for a panel of the given width and height. So rather than providing the width and height of the individual grid, it's much easier if this just takes the size of the panel and then we figure it out here. So this is going to resize the game to fit a panel of the given width and height. Alright, so first thing we need to do then is compute the size of any individual unit. So the height of any individual unit will be the width divided by the number of rows. Remember height and width flipped when you're working with 2D. It can be very confusing which one's X, which one's Y. I usually just figure it out by doing it wrong once, because it's just 50-50 whether I'm going to get it right or not. I can never remember, no matter how many times I work with it, which one's width, which one's height when you're working with rows and columns. But remember, if you think about it, columns are wide, rows are tall, right? Okay, and then I'm going to update the size of every individual item, so I'm going to use the for loop that I made again. Okay, and remember I made a handy method back in the grid thing in order to change their size or their location. So let's set their size first to, it's going to be height, then width, I think. We'll see. And then we're going to change their location as well, because if you think about it, right, they move based on how big they are. So your location depends on your size too. The smaller the panel goes, the closer you get to the top left corner, right? Because the smaller all the little grids above you are. So that's going to be proportional to, if the height is first, then it's going to be your position, so your row, and likewise your column. Alright, hopefully I got these in the right order there. Otherwise we'll just flip them, so again, something you do by trial and error. Okay, so that's everything we're probably going to need in order to get the game to work. Let's go back to our color grid and just instantiate a new one of these. So grid game manager game. Now I also need a reference to that color picker panel in order to properly draw in the right color. A lot of people struggled with this part. So the easiest way to provide a reference is either in the constructor or in a special method there. So I'm going to just have a variable called color picker panel that holds a reference to some color picker panel. I could add this to the constructor, or if I was really lazy, I could do something like this. I could just go back to the driver and say color grid panel dot picker panel equals, and then link it to the color picker panel that I've made up there. Okay, so better to have getters and setters or to do it in your constructor, but hey, this is perfectly fine too, so we'll just leave it like this, the lazy way for now. Back to grid. Okay, so that links them together, and now I can access the color from the picker panel because right after it's constructed, so this happens right after both of the frames are constructed, they will be linked together. Wonderful. So remember, you need a reference in order to link to something. You need reference to a specific instance. Some people also did it by, in their picker panel, making color static. If you make it static, then there's only one copy of color across the entire application. Each class, each instance of this class doesn't have its own. That would have been fine for this as well, because there's only ever one chosen color at a time. So that would have worked, actually. That would be a fine approach here. Alright, I'm going to instantiate my game based on the size of the panel originally. It just occurred to me that I forgot to call that update grid display method that I came up with. So remember, I said I was going to finish up the constructor by just using that. So there we go. Now it just fills the grid with a bunch of blank grid units and then updates their width and height. So as it turns out, I didn't actually need this constructor version that takes all the parameters. The blank one was good enough here. Sometimes you don't know what you need, so it's good to make a blank constructor and then also one that you think you might need. Okay. So what else do I need to do? I've already linked it to the picker panel. I need to add something that draws this, so let me add my good old paint component method. So drawing this to the screen is going to be as simple as calling the draw method in my game. So it's going to be game.drawGame. The other thing I want to do though is before I draw the game, in case the screen has resized, I'm going to update the display. This way, anytime paint component gets recalled and the display has changed size, and paint component gets called automatically whenever the user resizes the screen, we are going to see the game, the grid, get redrawn automatically. Okay. And now I have to do the mouse dragged thing. Okay, so if you implemented this using rectangles, you can simply use a dragged event. Dragged starts when the mouse clicks and ends when the mouse is released. Alright, so let's do the most straightforward version of this, which is if, we'll just do a double loop here. I'm going to copy it from the game manager. If game of row, of column, what did I call this thing again? Grid? Grid. If it contains the point, remember we wrote that custom contained method for it, then we are going to change the color of that grid unit to, and what did I call this? Picker panel? Picker panel dot color. Change the color of that grid unit to picker panel dot color. So this is the most simple version without the bonus. Let's see if we can get that to work. So I'll just pick a color here. Okay. I'm missing something. What's happening? Here's a hint. My old enemy, right? I forgot to repaint. So when rectangles are updated, unlike labels and buttons and panels, they don't update themselves automatically. You need to manually order the parent component, the panel in this case, to repaint itself. So add that repaint call on the bottom, and it will invoke paint component again. So now I can draw in cyan on the screen. That leaves just the final bonus, which is resizing this cursor when the keys are pressed. So first I'm going to need to add a cursor size variable. Let's just start it off at 2 for testing purposes. Alright, then I need to add the key listeners in order to be able to change it, so I'm going to add those to key press. Those are pretty straightforward, so I'm just going to copy them. If the user types a 0, it sets it to 0. If the user types a 1, it sets it to 1, and so forth. I called this K instead, right? And now for the hard part, how do you access the ones next to it? So if you did this using panels, buttons, labels, whatever, and you didn't use a two-dimensional array, this part is really difficult, right? But if you use a two-dimensional array, it's not so bad. So if the cursor is size 1, then we know we need to change the one at +1 and at -1. And if we want to do the diagonals too, then we need to change it at +1, -1 like that, and +1, -1 like that, all the different diagonal directions. So in total, there's 8 cardinal directions that we want to go in. And it's going to take you quite a long time to write out all those if statements. I'm not saying it wasn't incredibly tedious, and I'm definitely not going to do it here. But here you go, all those different if statements. You also needed to either exception handle or boundary check every possible different direction that you can go in. It would have taken quite a long time, but that brings us to the bonus. Start with size 2, there's a size 3, there's a size 4, and back to size 0. Pretty simple if you have a 2D array. Alright, so that's it for homework 1. Homework 2 is already up. It should be easier for you guys who spent 228 mostly looking at strings, harder for people who had 228 with me and didn't get to look at strings as much. You'll be converting things into UTF format. You've got to know how to save files, load files, and a little bit of swing as well. Okay, so that's going to be it for the day. We definitely don't have any more time. We will resume link layer and we will have the lab on Monday. And I will post this to Canvas very soon here. All right. See you next time.